One hot summer afternoon, when she was small, her mother took her hand and pressed it flat against the stone wall of a dairy cellar. The stone was so cold it almost stung, though the day outside shimmered with heat. Her mother held a candle low by the door, and the flame bent one way. She raised it high, and the flame bent the other. Feel that, her mother said. The room is breathing. She was too young to know why it mattered, and she filed it away. The wet limestone smell, the cold grit under her palm, for 15 years. She remembered it standing alone beside a fire-blackened ruin, a funeral behind her, a killing winter ahead, and no roof over her head. The day she understood the strange lesson had never been a lesson at all. The funeral wagon left her at the burned foundation and did not slow to see if she followed. Minta Belvale stood between two blackened walls with her trunk at her feet, and the November wind pushed a skim of soot across the ice that had formed overnight in the low places. She was 22 years old, 3 days without a mother, and now, by the reading of the will, the owner of 6 acres of frozen grass and a stone ruin that had held no roof in 5 years. Milo Drennan had told her at dawn, in the warm parlor of the ranch house, that she could not stay. He needed the room for hired men. The will gave her the parcel and nothing else, he said, and a parcel was not a bed. He said it kindly, the way a man is kind when he already has what he wants. So she counted what she had, standing there in the wind, because counting was the one thing she had always been able to do. $17.40 after the burying, 1 mare, 1 milk cow, a blanket roll. Food for 9 days if she ate the way a careful person eats. No standing house. No legal claim to a single stick of the ranch's firewood or a single forkful of its hay. 14 days, by her mother's own records, before the country usually took its first hard freeze. 22 miles of winter road to the nearest boarding room she could not afford past a week. She could not leave. That was the cruelty of it. If she sold the parcel, Milo got the spring that watered the north pasture and the wagon road that ran close to the rails, and he would have her mother's last gift for the price of a used harness. If she walked away, the ranch swallowed the 6 acres by spring, and the one thing Ora Vale had placed by name in her youngest daughter's hands would be gone as if it had never been written. Everything else her mother owned had gone to Lavinia and Cora. This was hers. She did not yet understand why it was worth taking, but she understood that her mother had meant her to keep it, and Ora Vale had never in her life meant a thing by accident. Her sisters had not come to see her off. Lavinia had said all she meant to say at the reading, when the lawyer set 2 heavy deeds before the older girls and pressed 1 smoke-stained iron key into Minta's palm. She left you nothing but rocks. Lavinia had not even lowered her voice. The key was in Minta's coat pocket now. She could feel the shape of it against her hip. Someone had scratched a single word into the iron with a nail. Not a building's name, not a date. 1 word, center. She had turned it over 100 times since and understood nothing. By afternoon, a wagon came up the frozen ruts from the ranch road, and it was not a friendly one. Eberpike drove it, and Milo Drennan rode beside him, and Minta knew before they stopped what the visit was. Pike was near 60, a barrel of a man who had spent his best years as an army commissary sergeant at Fort Keogh before he opened his feed and hardware store in town. He had fed a fort through hard winters. He had also, in his own telling, buried more than one fool who thought a hole in the ground was the same thing as a house. Milo had brought him to say the thing Milo wanted said, in a voice the whole county would believe. Pike climbed down and walked the ruin without being asked. He put his hand flat against the standing wall and pushed, testing it. He looked up at the chimney which rose past the second course of stone, and then stopped where a crack ran clean through it below the shoulder. He towed the frozen mortar where it had crumbled out from between the lower stones. He looked at the ground and where it sloped and where it sloped too. No roof, Pike said. No well I can see. No woodpile. Chimneys split below the shoulder. You light a fire under that and you'll crack it the rest of the way the first cold night. Mortar's froze and half of it's gone, and the whole floor tips toward that swamp. He pointed with his chin at the gray line of cottonwoods where the river bent back on itself. Water runs downhill, girl. In spring it'll run into whatever you dig here. I didn't say I meant to dig, Minta said. You didn't say much of anything. That's the only sensible thing I've heard from you. Pike wiped his hand on his coat. You want to know what it cost to put even a small cabin up out here before the freeze? More than you've got. And a cabin built poor and quick burns wood like a furnace burns coal. You'd want 6 cords, maybe 8, and you couldn't cut and haul 2 before the snow closed you out. He looked at her, and there was no meanness in it, which was worse than meanness. Sell it. Drennan's still offering money. By Christmas, these stones will be carrying your name instead of a roof, and a name carved in cold stone is the last thing your mother would have wanted for you. Milo said nothing. He did not need to. He let Pike's words settle, and he watched Minta's face for the crack he expected, and he did not find it, because Minta had spent 22 years teaching people to read nothing there. Thank you for coming, she said. They left before the light went. She did not watch them go. She sat on her trunk with her mother's survey unrolled across her knees, waited at the corners with 4 burned stones, and she read it the way she read everything, which was slowly and twice, and the second time she found the lie. The outside of the foundation, wall to wall, ran 74 feet. Her mother had paced it and measured it and written the number in her own hand at the reading, part of the parcel's legal bounds. But lower on the same page, where Aura had sketched the interior of the old granary as she remembered it, the inside measured 68. 6 feet gone. 3 at each end, hidden inside walls that were nowhere near 3 feet thick. Minta went to the center of the floor. Her mother's last words had been so faint she had bent her ear to her mouth to catch them. When the house grows loud, look beneath what burned. She had thought it fever. She had held her mother's hand and thought the words were fever. She swept the wind-blown ash aside with the flat of her boot, and then with her mittened hands, and there under it the floor stones changed. In the center, a square of them had been set with a finer, paler mortar than the rough gray fill around them, laid close, and even the way a careful mason lays a thing he means to find again. She dug. The ground had begun to freeze on top, and the shovel rang against it, and her shoulders burned before she was a foot down. She stopped once to breathe and heard nothing but wind and the far complaint of a cattle bell. At 2 feet, the soil turned looser, backfilled, not virgin ground. At 3 feet, the shovel struck something that did not ring like stone and did not thud like earth. It knocked, hollow and dull, the way a knuckle knocks on a door. She cleared it with her hands. Oak, blackened with pitch, laid in planks and banded with iron. A hatch, and set into it an iron ring, but the ring would not lift because someone had packed it solid with wax and wound it in oilcloth, sealing it against water and air and time. Her mother had not hidden a cellar. Her mother had sealed, one, the way you seal a thing you mean to survive you. Minta worked the wax loose with her knife in the last of the light, her fingers gone stupid with cold, and she did not open the hatch that night. She was not a fool. She had heard the same stories Pike told, of cellars that flooded, cellars that filled with bad air, men found blue in the morning beside a stove that had eaten every breath in the room. She would not climb down into the dark of a place she did not understand with the sun already gone. But she pried the hatch up a hand's width and held her candle to the gap. The air that came up was not the wet grave smell she had braced for. It was dry. It smelled of stacked wood and cold stone, and under that, faintly, of apples and of something metallic she could not name. Her candle flame did not gutter and die. It leaned, bent hard to one side and held there. And Minta understood, watching it, that air was moving down there. Something breathed under her mother's ruin. Somewhere below, in the dark, an inlet let cold air in and a vent let it out, and the two of them pulled at the little flame in her hand. She widened the gap and lowered the candle on a string as far as her arm would reach. She saw stone steps going down. She saw the edge of a shelf. She saw, at the very limit of the light, the round cut ends of split firewood, stacked and disappearing into a black that the candle could not reach the end of. She saw, chalked on the near wall in a hand she had known her whole life, her mother's neat small figures, numbers, always numbers. And she saw a closed plank door, and above it, in that same chalk hand, 4 words that made the hair rise on her neck. Dry room, no lamp. She did not know yet how far the firewood went. She did not know what a dry room was or why a lamp would be forbidden in it. She knew only that her mother had built something enormous under the thing the whole county called worthless, and had died with the map of it inside her own head, and had left her youngest daughter one iron key with one word on it. Then, from the far end of the dark below, from somewhere past the reach of any candle, came a sound. 3 slow knocks, and after them the soft sifting hiss of falling earth. Minta went cold in a way the wind had nothing to do with. She lowered the hatch, weighted it with a stone, and sat beside it in the dark, and she did not sleep. The knocking did not come again, but the sound of the falling earth stayed in her the way a threat stays. Something down there was still moving. Something down there was not finished settling. She needed a man who understood stone, and she thought she knew from the numbers in her mother's notebook exactly whose name to find. The name written beside half her mother's measurements was Brecka. She found him the next afternoon in a low sod-roofed house near the rail spur, a Norwegian near 61, wide through the shoulders even now, with hands that looked as though they had been shaped by the same tools they used. Bernd Brecka had been a stone mason and a mine timberman and a freight hauler, and he had built cold rooms up and down the Yellowstone for men with more money than he would ever have. When Minta said her mother's name, he set down the harness he was mending and looked at her a long moment. "You found the center hatch," he said. It was not a question. "You knew about it." "I built it, part of it, with her." He did not smile. "She made me swear I would not open my mouth about it to a living soul, and I have not to your sisters, not to that store sergeant, not to the man Cora married. She said the daughter who found the center would be the one to have it. I did not know which of you that would be." He looked at Minta's hands, at the raw split knuckles from the shovel, and something in his face settled. "I see now she guessed right." "There's something wrong with it," Minta said. Something moved. There was a knocking, and then earth fell. Brecka was on his feet before she finished, but he did not hurry to celebrate, and he did not let her hurry either. On the way out, he took up a canvas roll of tools and a lantern and a coil of thread, and when they reached the ruin, he would not let her go down first, and he would not let either of them go down far until he had tested the thing she wanted so badly to trust. He taught her without meaning to teach. That was his way she would learn. He did the thing, and if you watched, you learned it, and if you did not watch, that was your own affair. He hung a length of loose wool thread near the first opening and watched which way it drifted, reading the air the way a sailor reads a flag. Good, he said. It still draws. A cellar that does not breathe will kill you politely while you sleep. He went down the steps with the lantern low, and at each hewn beam that carried the earth overhead, he struck it once with a wooden mallet and put his ear near and listened to the sound come back. Most rang tight and solid. One, near the damp end, came back soft and hollow, and he grunted and moved past it, and did not stand beneath it again. He pressed a sheet of dry paper flat to the mortar of the north wall, and left it, to see by morning whether the stone was weeping water behind its face. He laid a length of thin tubing filled with water along the floor, and marked where the two ends stood, reading the slope of the ground the way a doctor reads a pulse. By the end of it he could tell her what she had. 2 long chambers full of firewood, and it was more wood than she had ever seen stacked in one place in her life. One of them dry as a bone, one with a dark, damp corner where a drain had plugged and the wet had crept in. A winter room, walled and roofed, meant to be lived in, with a stone hollow for a stove. But the iron pipe that should carry the smoke up through the ruin had rusted clean through. A dry room and a cold room behind their own doors, and one split roof brace in the damp chamber, the one that had knocked and let the earth fall, holding a load it could no longer be trusted with. Your mother started this after the river took the old storehouse in '81, Brecca said, sitting on the bottom step, breathing harder than the climb should have cost him. She watched a flood carry off a year of stores in one night, and she decided the ground would keep what the weather could not be trusted with. The granary burned above. Later, a lamp, a dry summer, who knows? She let it stay burned. A ruin nobody wants is the best lock there is. He looked around at the dark. She bought the wood a little at a time when the ranch hands would have been idle anyway. Bought the flour cheap after harvest, bought the blankets off the army when the fort turned them out. No one thing large enough to make a man ask a question. 5 years of small, quiet choices, and this is what they built. It's not finished, Minta said. She had understood that much already. It was never a house. It was a storehouse. No, Brecca agreed. It was made to keep things, not people. If you mean to live in it through a winter, you have work ahead, and you have it wrong the first time. It kills you. He said this plainly, the way he said everything. You heat one small room, not the whole of it. You keep the fire and the wood and the food behind stone from one another, or a spark finds 50 cords, and you have built the biggest chimney in Montana. You feed the fire air from outside, through its own duct, or it eats the air you are breathing, and you leave the cold rooms cold. The ground keeps them cool for you. Do not fight the ground. Use it. 4 things. Minta turned them in her mind the way she turned the key. Heat one room. Keep fire, fuel, and food apart. Give the fire its own air. Let the cold stay cold. It was then that Tabitha Hales came. She was a neighbor, a widow of 26 with 2 small children and a homestead a mile east, and she had heard the rumor already, everyone had, that the Vale girl was living in a grave out on the burned parcel. She came to see it for herself, and she was not unkind, but she was not soft either, because a widow with 2 children on the plains cannot afford to be soft. Tabitha walked the winter room slowly and admitted the air was good, cool, and dry, better than her own cabin that sweated on cold nights until the walls ran. Then she stopped and lifted the lantern and pointed at the north wall, where a pale mineral line ran level across the stone at the height of Minta's chest. That line came from water, Tabitha said. Before the drain plugged, Minta answered. It's dry now. And when the thaw comes in spring and the ground still froze underneath so the melt can't sink and it runs down here by the barrel and the ice closes that drain outlet you're all so proud of. Tabitha lowered the lantern. Where does the water go then? Minta had no answer. She stood there with the question sitting in her chest like a swallowed stone, and Tabitha nodded, not in triumph, only in the way of a woman confirming what she had expected. I hope it holds, Tabitha said. I mean that, but I've buried a husband and I've learned the country doesn't care what we hope. She gathered her shawl. Water always wins in the end. You just try to lose slower than it. She left, and the spring thaw, still 4 months off, took up its place in Minta's mind beside the January freeze. 2 dangers now, one at each end of the winter, and the winter room caught between them. Breke would work for food, and for what she could repay him after the spring, but he could not do the hauling, and the splitting, and the sealing. His lungs would not let him, and Minta had seen, though he had turned away quickly, the dark stain on the handkerchief he pressed to his mouth after the climb. Most of the labor would be hers, and when she added the cost of the things she could not make, a new length of stovepipe and its elbows, nails and strap iron, 2 hinges, lamp oil, lime for the walls, a little sheet iron to lay beneath the stove, canvas, rope, salt, a bit of medicine. He was left with something near $12 to carry her through a Montana winter. She began that afternoon by pulling the split roof brace, because a thing that could fall on you was the first thing to deal with. She and Breke rigged a short timber crib beneath the load the way he showed her, to catch the weight before she freed the broken post. But when the old brace came out, the earth above did not wait to be caught. A thin stream of soil began to sift down through a seam in the plank ceiling, a steady, whispering fall of dirt. And it fell, of all the places it could have fallen, directly onto the one flat patch of floor where the stove was meant to stand. By the 3rd day, the story had reached Miles City, and by the time it reached town, it had stopped resembling anything true. They said the youngest Vale girl was living in a grave. They said she was burning her dead mother's papers by the armload. They said she was digging out there for money her father had buried, or for gold, or for nothing at all, mad with grief. They said she was hoarding ranch supplies that rightly belonged to Lavinia and Cora, and that she meant to drag the whole estate into court. At Pike's store, a man leaned on the counter and called the place Minta's Burrow, and the name stuck the way an ugly name always sticks, and men laughed and repeated it, and the laughing traveled faster than the truth ever could. Milo Drennan let the talk do its work, and then he came himself. He came alone the first time, and he was reasonable, which was how Minta knew to be afraid. He offered her $20 for the parcel. When she said nothing, he made it $30, and he spread his hands and spoke of the spring the North cattle needed, and the wagon road that ran close to the rails, and how it only made sense, how her mother could not have wanted her freezing out here alone, how there was a warm room at the ranch house where she could stay as a dependent of the family if only she would sign. No, Minta said. Milo's face did not change, but his voice did, dropping the warmth the way a man drops a tool he no longer needs. You understand those chambers were dug with ranch labor, ranch tools, ranch time. That makes them part of the cattle operation, not part of your 6 acres. I could put that to a judge. The survey puts every foot of that foundation inside my line, Minta said. My mother's separate property, registered in her own name, under her own right, protected from every debt but her own. You know that. You married into a family where the women kept their own books. It was the most she had said to any man in a week, and it cost her, and it landed. Milo knew the survey was against him. He knew a court might not give him the vault, But he also knew that a court could freeze her out of it for months while it decided, long enough for winter to do to her what no judge would. He filed the knowledge away and left, and his leaving was worse than his coming. He came back 3 days later, and this time he brought 2 hired men and a wagon, and they walked past Minta as if she were a fence post, and began carrying the dry, seasoned firewood up out of the gallery and stacking it in the wagon bed. Minta stepped into the mouth of the passage and stood there. She did not shout. She reached into her coat, and she began to lay things out on the top step, one at a time, where all 3 men could see them. The deed, with the county seal, her mother's inventory in her mother's hand, the receipts, dated and signed, bearing Ora Vale's own separate property registration, and a statement dated that week and signed by Bernd Breke, naming the chambers as Ora Vale's private work, built with her own money and his own hands. "Load 1 more stick," Minta said, "and every man who touched it is named in what I take to the sheriff, including the 2 of you." She looked at the hired men, not at Milo. "Ask him if his court claim is worth a theft charge with your names on it." The hired men stopped. Milo looked at the papers a long moment, and then he told his men to put the wood back, not because he believed the vault was hers, but because a man building a legal claim does not want a theft on the record beside it. He understood that much. He put the wood back to the last split log, and then he came close to Minta, close enough that she could smell the cold on him. "You'll come to us before February," he said quietly. "When the food runs out and the fire won't light and you're sick of the dark, you'll come up to that warm house and knock, and I'll be the one who opens the door. Remember that I offered you $30 while you still had your pride." He climbed into the empty wagon and drove off toward the ranch, and Minta stood in the cold with her mother's papers in her hands and did not let herself shake until he was gone. Tell us in the comments, have you ever kept building something after someone with more experience, more money, more power, looked you in the eye and told you it would never work? We want to hear it. Her sisters chose their sides the way they had chosen them at the reading. Lavinia would not come. She would not set her boot on the parcel, would not so much as look toward the burned foundation from the ranch house porch, as if acknowledging it existed would cost her something. But Cora came once in the dusk with a black iron kettle wrapped in a flour sack, and she pressed it into Minta's hands and would not meet her eyes. "He can't know I came," Cora said. "Please, he can't know." And she was gone before Minta could thank her, hurrying back across the frozen grass toward the lights of the house, a woman already beginning to doubt the man she had married and not yet brave enough to say so out loud. Minta stood with the warm kettle against her chest and understood, in that moment, the true price of the thing her mother had left her. It was not only cold and labor and money she did not have. It was this, that to keep it, she might have to let it split her family down the middle, and that some of those cracks would never close. She started work in earnest the next morning, and the next morning gave her its answer to whether she'd be allowed to work in peace. The uphill drainage trench, the stone-lined channel her mother had cut above the foundation to turn seepage away before it ever reached the walls, was filled, not fallen in. Filled, packed to the brim with manure and straw and shovelfuls of frozen earth, tamped down hard, the whole length of it choked, so that the next melt would have nowhere to run but down, into the ground above her chambers and through the walls. She knelt over it a long time. She could have driven straight to the ranch and screamed Milo's name, but she had learned from a woman who never once raised her voice, and she knew that an accusation without proof was only noise, and noise was what Milo wanted. Brecca came and knelt beside her and dug his bare fingers into the fill and turned it over and showed her, without a word, what it was telling them. The straw was wagon cut, chopped short the way a hired man chops it, not the long, loose straw of a natural drift. The manure was fresh, laid within days, still holding a faint warmth deep in the pile where the frost had not yet reached. This had not slid down on its own. A wagon had brought it, and men had packed it, and they had done it in the dark. "You cannot prove whose wagon," Brecca said, standing, one hand pressed to his side. "So you do not try. You do the other thing." He looked up the slope, reading the land. "You cut your own drain, inside your own line, where no man has the right to touch it, and you cut it so it works better than the one they buried, and then it will not matter what they bury, because the water will already be gone before it reaches you." It meant a new trench, 48 feet of it, through gravel above and clay below, running from the high uphill corner clear around to the low bank where the ground fell away toward the swamp, and every foot of it hers by law. 48 feet of frozen ground with 14 days, maybe fewer now, before the first real snow. Brecca showed her how to build a drain that would not betray her. Large flat stones laid in the bottom for a floor. Smaller stones set on top with gaps left open between them so the water had a path to run through and the earth could not choke it. Sod and packed clay capped over the hole so the fill above could not sift down and plug it. And the fall of it, this was the thing he made her understand with her own hands. The fall of it had to be steady and continuous, dropping toward the low bank without a single dip along the way, because any low spot would trap standing water, and standing water would freeze, and freezing water split stone the way a wedge splits a log. He would not let her guess at the slope. He made her test it the way her mother would have, one bucket poured at the high end, the two of them watching where the water ran quick and where it hesitated and pooled. Where it hesitated, she dug the channel deeper and poured again and watched again until the water ran the whole 48 feet without stopping to think. The work took the skin off her hands. By the third day, her knuckles had split and scabbed and split again, and the pick handle wore a raw stripe across both palms that no glove could quite protect. The frost had come into the top foot of the ground, and she broke it up an inch at a time, and below the frost the clay came up in heavy blue-gray clots that clung to the shovel and doubled its weight. She lost feeling in 2 fingers of her right hand after a morning of gripping cold iron, and it did not fully come back that night or the next. But the trench went in, foot by measured foot, and each night she scratched the tally on the winter room wall beneath her mother's old figures, the way her mother had taught her without ever saying she was teaching. 12 feet, 19, 26, measurable, real, a thing the dark and the cold and Milo Drennan could not argue with, because it was there in the ground, and it worked. On the 9th day, the sky in the west went the color of a bruise and stayed that way past noon, and Brecca stood in the mouth of the trench and looked at it and said, the snow was close now, days off, not weeks. Minta had 31 feet of drain finished and 17 left to cut, a stovepipe still lying in its wrapping unmounted, a cracked chimney she had not dared light a fire in, a roof seam still sifting dirt onto the very stone where her stove must stand, and $11 and some cents between her and the whole of the winter. She did not stop. She wrapped her ruined hands in strips of the flour sack Cora had brought, and she went back down into the trench, and she cut. Behind her, in the dark, below the burned foundation, 52 cords of her mother's firewood waited in the cold, more fuel than the whole family would burn in 3 winters, and she could not yet light so much as a candle near it. Above her the first flakes came down out of the bruised sky, fine and dry and hurrying on the wind, not the soft snow of a mild year, but the hard small snow that meant the country had decided to stop being merciful. Minta looked up at it once, and then she looked back down at the frozen ground, and she drove the pick in again. The first snow was not the storm that would try to kill her. It was the country's warning that the storm was coming. It fell for a day and a night, fine and dry and driven sideways, and Minta worked through all of it because she had no choice. She finished the drain in that snow, the last 17 feet of it, breaking the frozen crust with the pick and lining the channel with the flat stones Breka had taught her to choose. Broad ones for the floor, smaller ones set with gaps above, sod and clay packed over the top. When the last stone went in, she poured a bucket at the high corner, and the two of them stood in the falling snow and watched the water run the full 48 feet and out the low bank without hesitating once. Breka nodded. It was the only praise he gave, and Minta found it was enough. Then the snow stopped, and a weak sun came, and the country pretended for 3 days that it had not meant it. Breka was not fooled. "It is loading the gun," he said. "You have the drain. Now you need a roof you can stand under and a fire you can light without dying of it, both, before it comes back for the second time." The roof brace came first because a thing that could fall on your head could not wait behind a thing that only made you cold. The split post in the damp chamber still carried the weight of the earth overhead, and above it the seam still wept its thin trickle of soil onto the very stone where the stove had to stand. Breka would not let her simply knock the broken post out and slide a new one under. "You take the load off a wall a little at a time," he said, "or the wall teaches you why." They built a crib of short timbers beside the broken post and drove hardwood wedges between the crib and the beam it had to catch, tapping them, only tapping, transferring the weight of the roof one small bite at a time from the failing post to the new. It was slow, maddening work in the cold, and it demanded a kind of patience Minta had in her bones and Breka had spent his life on. When the crib had taken the weight, he knocked the split post free, and it came out light and useless in her hands, and she understood how close it had been to letting go on its own. Then he set the new cap beam broader than the old post, spreading the load across a wider span. And here Minta made her mistake. She misread the order of the wedges and drove the third before the second, and the load came onto the new beam unevenly all at once before it was seated. The roof dropped, less than an inch. But an inch was enough. A sheet of soil came down through the seam in a rush, and the draft took the dust of it, and the lamp went out, and the two of them were in a black so complete that Minta could not see her own hands, standing under thousands of pounds of frozen earth that had just moved. "Do not run," Breka said out of the dark, calm as a man at his own supper table. The beam held. "Feel for the wedges. We seat them right, and it holds for 100 years. His hand found her shoulder, steady. "You learned the order of the wedges just now. You will not forget it. That is what a mistake is for." They lit the lamp. The beam had held. She seated the wedges in the right order, and the roof did not move again, and the seam, packed now beneath the broad new cap, stopped weeping its dirt onto the stove site. It had cost her a night and a fright she would feel in her chest for weeks, but the stone where the fire would go was dry, and the earth above it was carried, and she scratched it on the wall. Roof braced. One more thing the dark could not argue with. She was thinner now. She had been eating like a careful person, and then like a hungry one, stretching the 9 days of food into 15 by taking less than she burned, and it showed in her wrists and in the new hollow beneath her cheekbones. Her knuckles had split and healed and split again into a permanent map of small scars. A great bruise had spread across her right shoulder from carrying the coiled stovepipe up from town on her back, black going to green at the edges. And there was a cough now, low in her chest, from the lime dust she breathed all day, whitewashing the winter room walls, the lime that would brighten the dark room and keep it clean, but that hung in the closed air and scoured her throat raw. Brecca coughed too, worse than she did, and not from lime. She saw him turn from her more than once and press the handkerchief to his mouth, and she saw, one gray morning before he could fold it away, the bright thread of blood on the cloth. She said nothing. He would not have thanked her for it. But she began, without a word about why, to carry the heavier things herself and to save him the stairs, and he let her, which told her more than any confession would have. The stove was the whole of it, the thing that made a storeroom into a place a person could live, and the thing most likely to kill her if she got it wrong. Bricka built it the way he did everything, slowly and in the right order, and Minta learned it with her hands. They set the little cast-iron box stove inside a hollow of stone so that no wooden thing stood near enough to take a spark. They laid sheet iron beneath it and up the wall behind it, a shield against the heat. They built the base of a masonry chimney to carry the new pipe up through the burned foundation to the open air, tall enough now, above the broken shoulder of the old crack so no fire ever touched that weakness. And then the two things that made Bricka's cellars different from the graves Pike warned about. A low wooden duct that ran from outside straight to the stove's feet, so the fire drank cold air from the world above, and not the air in the room, and on the far wall, high up, a vent to let the used air climb away and out. Air came in low and cold, air left high and warm. The room breathed. He would not let her light it on faith. He set 2 candles in the finished room, one on the floor near the intake duct, one high on a shelf near the exhaust vent, and he made her watch. The low flame bent inward, toward the room, drawn by the incoming air. The high flame bent outward, toward the vent, pushed by the air leaving. 2 flames leaning in opposite directions, and between them a room that moved its own air without a soul touching it. "Now," Brecka said, "now you may light the stove." She lit it. The smoke climbed the pipe and did not come back. The little iron box ticked and warmed, and for the first time since the wagon had left her at the ruin, Minta Bell Vale stood in a warm room, underground, with the wind she could not hear turning the world white above her head. She did not let herself enjoy it long. Tabitha Hales came the next day, and she did not come empty-handed. She had 2 doors in her wagon, salvaged from an abandoned shed on the far side of her claim, good plank doors with the hinges still on them. "You need a wall between your fire and all that wood," Tabitha said, not looking at Minta busying herself with the tailgate. "A shed with no roof doesn't need its doors. Take them." She would not call it charity. She named a price of 2 days' help come spring, when Minta had hands to spare, and they both knew the price was a fiction to let a proud woman accept a gift. Minta accepted it. Together they hung one of the doors in the passage between the winter room and the fuel gallery, a fire break, a wall of plank between the flame and the 52 cords. And the 2 women stood back and looked at it, and something passed between them that was not yet friendship, but was on the road to it. "I still think the thaw takes you," Tabitha said, "but the air in here's drier than my own house. I'll give you that." Eber Pike came before the second storm, because Milo sent him again, hoping for the same verdict. He did not get the same verdict, and it plainly cost him something to say so. Pike went through the whole of it. He put his hand in the drain and felt the fall of it. He measured the clearance around the stove and grunted at the sheet iron. He watched the 2 candles lean their opposite ways and stood a while over the low intake duct, and Minta could see him fitting what he saw against everything he had buried in his commissary years. When he was done, He did not take back a word he'd said, but he sharpened it. "You've built better than I thought a girl alone could build," Pike said. "The drainage is right. The draft is right. I'll not pretend otherwise." He turned in the low room and looked toward the black mouth of the fuel gallery, where the firewood ran back into the dark. "But you've got 50 cords of dry wood behind one plank door and a fire 10 feet from it. One spark past that door, and you're not living in a cellar anymore. You're living in a firebox, and there's one way out, and it's a ladder. You leave gaps between your stacks, a hand's width every few feet, so a fire can't run the length of it. You keep buckets of water by the stove, and a barrel of sand, and wet wool blankets you can throw. You do that, or the thing that kills you won't be the cold." Minta did it. She broke the great stacks into sections with gaps between them, and she filled the buckets, and she set the sand barrel by the stove door and the wet blankets folded beside it. Pike watched her start, and then he climbed the ladder toward the gray light, and at the top he stopped. "You've improved the grave," he said down into the dark. "That doesn't make it a house." And then the country came back for the second time, the way Brecca had said it would. The first true storm of the season came in the last week of November, days of hard snow on a wind that found every gap in the ranch house's frame walls a mile off and rattled its windows in their casings until the family slept in their coats. Milo had not gathered enough hay. The cattle drifted and bawled against the fences, and the ranch house burned wood the way a fire burns paper, cord after cord up its wide, drafty chimney to hold the rooms at something a person could bear. Down in the vault, unheated, with the stove let go cold to save fuel, Minta watched the thermometer Brecca had lent her sit at 41 degrees and not move. Not warm, but 41 degrees while the wind outside stood at 0, and the ranch house upstairs devoured its winter in a week. For the first time, the difference between the two was a number, and the number was on Minta's side. She lit the stove properly for the first sustained cold near the 1st of December, and the vault taught her its last hard lesson before the true test came. The wind swung around to the west in the night, and it came at the chimney from the side, and it drove the smoke back down the pipe. Minta woke to it, the smell first, then the sting in her eyes, then the low haze hanging in the room where clean air should have been. Pike's warning, half proven, a downdraft. She did not panic, and she did not pile on more fire, which was the thing a frightened person does. She thought it through the way Brecca had taught her to think. She closed the shutter on the west-facing vent, the one the wind was pushing against. She opened the high vent on the leeward side, where the wind pulled instead of pushed. She cut the stove's draft down small, and in the morning she and Brecca fitted the last length of pipe to raise the chimney higher yet, and built a simple angled cap over its mouth, a little roof that let the smoke out but turned the sideways wind away from the opening. The smoke climbed clean after that, and Brecca, when it was done, made her take the whole thing apart in her mind and do it again out loud. Which shutter, which vent, which order, until she could have done it blind. "The wind will not come the same way twice," he said. "You do not memorize the fix. You understand the room. Then any wind, you answer it." By the second week of December, she had numbers, and the numbers were the argument no skeptic could shout down. On a morning the thermometer outside read 15 below 0. She recorded them the way her mother would have. The empty ranch storehouse, unheated, stood at 9 degrees, cold enough to freeze anything left in it solid. The vault's cold room, against the north wall, sat at 36, cold but above the killing line, the potatoes and turnips and cabbages sound. And the winter room, after the stove had burned low all night untended, held at 54. She had burned, in the whole of a day and a night, something near an eighth of a cord. An eighth of a cord. The ranch house upstairs burned that before noon, but the skeptics did not fall in a row like cut wheat, because real skeptics never do. Pike, when Tabitha told him the numbers, only said that one good week did not prove a roof could carry 4 feet of snow, and he was right that it did not. Tabitha, who came often now and stayed longer, still put her hand on the mineral line each visit and said the real test would come with the meltwater, and she was right too. And Milo, when the numbers reached him, said the thing that lodged in Minta deepest of all, because it was not a lie. "She's warm," he said where Cora could hear and carry it. "Warm and fed, alone in her hole, while I've got a house full of people and hired men and 1,000 head of cattle to keep alive. It's easy to keep one person warm. Let her try keeping a family." It struck Minta because there was truth in it. One person was easy. She began that week to give what she could. She carried 2 of the 18 wool blankets across the snow to Tabitha's cabin, and beans enough for 3 weeks, and she offered Cora firewood for the ranch house. Cora's eyes went to it with naked want, but Milo forbade it. To take Minta's wood was to admit the wood was Minta's, and Milo would sooner be cold than admit that. Lavinia said only when the offer reached her the same words she had said at the reading, worn smooth now with use. "Keep the rocks. We still have the ranch." They still had the ranch, but January was coming, and January that year had made other plans. The heavy snow began in the first week of it, and it did not let up the way November's had. It came and came, and between the falls the cold sank down and stayed, a still, enormous cold that cracked the trees along the river, with sounds like distant rifle shots. Milo's hay reserve dropped below a week's feed. The cattle stopped drifting and began to stand, heads down, packing themselves against the fences and the buildings for the little shelter the walls gave. The railroad's deliveries came late, then came erratic, then, some days, did not come at all. And the ranch house, that great drafty frame box, needed feeding around the clock now just to keep the water from freezing in the pitchers. On the 28th of January, the telegraph line to town went dead in the middle of the day. Minta was at the top of the ladder when it happened, looking east, and she saw the sky over the river do a thing she had never seen a sky do. It did not darken. It disappeared, the whole eastern world simply gone, erased behind a wall of white that was moving toward her faster than a horse could run. Behind her, Brecca came up the ladder one slow rung at a time, and he looked at what she was looking at, and he did not say anything clever or calm. He said only 5 words quietly, the way a man speaks in church. "This is the one," he said. "This is the one your mother built for." The storm reached the ranch on a north wind strong enough to erase the buildings from one another. Minta had been through hard weather her whole life. She had never been through anything that felt like a living thing with a will. The wind did not gust and fall. It stood, a solid pressure that leaned on the world and did not let up, and the snow it carried was not falling snow, but flung snow, fine as flour and moving flat, so that a man could look straight into it and see nothing at all, not his own outstretched hand. The temperature fell through 0 in the first hour and kept going down, and the cold that came with the wind was a cold that hunted. It found the seam of a coat, the gap at a wrist, and it went in after the life like a knife. She did what Brecca had drilled into her in order, without stopping to feel afraid. She closed and barred both exterior shutters over the vents. She checked the angled cap on the chimney. She covered the drain against drifting. She shut the fuel room doors. She ran the rope she had rigged, hand lines strung taut between the hatch, the tall vent pole, and the cattle fence, so that a person could cross the blind yard by hand and not by sight. She filled every vessel she had with water while the water still ran. And then she went below and pulled the hatch down over her head, and the shriek of the wind became a low, enormous moan through 30 feet of earth and stone, and the little stove ticked in its hollow, and the room held. Tabitha was already there with her 2 children, having come the day before at Minta's, asking when the sky first looked wrong. They were safe, the little ones wrapped and warm on the bench that folded down into a bed. Brecca was there. For 1 hour, in the deepest cold that country had seen in a decade, the vault held 11 degrees warmer than the world by simple stillness, and then, with the stove going, near 60. And Minta let herself believe for that 1 hour that it was going to be all right. Then Brecca went to check the chimney draft at the top of the stair, and he did not come back down. She found him 3 rungs up the ladder, gripping it with both hands, unable to go higher or lower. His face had gone gray, and his lips had a blue cast to them that was not the cold, and each breath came short and tearing with a wet sound underneath it. The chest pain had him. He got out one sentence, forced through his teeth. "Not the heart," he said. "The lungs. I cannot climb." And then he could not speak at all, only breathe and hold the ladder and look at her. Minta got him down. She got him onto the bench and propped him up so the fluid in his lungs would not drown him lying flat, and she put a blanket around him, and she understood, kneeling there with his terrible breathing filling the small room, that the man who had taught her everything could no longer lift a stone or seat a wedge or clear a vent. For the first time since she had pried the hatch open, she was alone with the thing her mother built. Brecca could still see. He could still tell her when she was wrong, and he would, all through the night, from the bench. But the doing of it was hers now, all of it, and the lives in the room were hers. She did not have time to be afraid of that, because that was when she looked up the vent pipe on instinct, the way you glance at a sick child, and saw that she could no longer see the ranch house. She had been able to, before, in the gaps between the worst of the wind, a smudge of the house's chimney smoke standing gray against the white. Now she watched for it, and it was not there. She waited through 3 long pulls of the wind for it to show, and it did not show. And Minta knew, the way she knew numbers, what a vanished chimney smoke meant. Either the fire in that house had gone out, or the chimney had come down. Either way, the ranch house had stopped being warm, and there were 7 people in it, and 2 of them were children. She could not see it, but she had strung the ropes for exactly this. She tied one around her waist, cinched hard, and made the other end fast to the iron ring inside the hatch, and she told Tabitha to feed it out and to haul it back the moment she felt 3 sharp pulls or felt it go slack. "If I don't pull, and I don't come," Minta said, "you do not come after me. You have your children and 8 other people and the fire. You keep them. That's the whole of your job. Say it back to me." "I keep them," Tabitha said. Her jaw was tight. "Go." Minta went up into the white. If you're gripped by whether she can even cross that yard, 1 rope, no sight, 40 below in the wind, then subscribe and stay with this story, because reaching the house is only the first half of the test. What happens after she gets them back down is what her mother truly built for. The crossing that should have taken 2 minutes took her the better part of a quarter hour, and twice in it she lost the world entirely. The rope was the only real thing. The wind stood her sideways, and the snow packed against the wind side of her face until she had to turn her head to breathe, and the cold got into her chest so fast that she stopped feeling her own feet before she was halfway. She went hand over hand along the line, and at the fence she found the second rope by feel and turned along it, and once her mitten came off the line for a moment in a gust, and she felt the pure animal terror of a person untethered in a place that wanted her dead. She got it back. She kept going. The dark bulk of the house rose out of the white when she was close enough to touch it. Inside was worse than she had let herself imagine. The chimney had failed, the cap torn off in the wind, and then a downdraft driving smoke and sparks back into the parlor, so the fire had to be smothered or burn the house down around them, and now there was almost no fire at all. The great drafty rooms had gone cold as a cave. Water stood frozen in a bedroom pitcher. Lavinia sat in a corner with her son Perrin wrapped against her under a pile of quilts, her face rigid. A hired man crouched by the dead stove holding his hand, and Minta saw the fingers were the wrong color. Milo was up on a chair with a lamp, trying to reach the chimney's throat from inside, doing a useless brave thing because he did not know what else to do. And on the floor near the smoking stove, Cora knelt over her 4-year-old daughter, Nella, rubbing the child's arms and saying her name over and over, and the child was not answering. "Blankets and food you can carry in your arms, and nothing else," Minta said from the doorway, and her voice came out with an authority she had never used before and did not know she had. "The house is finished. You come now, on the rope, or you die here tonight. Move." "No." Milo got down off the chair. "We're not going out in that on your say-so. Nobody could cross that yard. We stay, we get the fire going. There is no fire," Minta said. "There is no chimney. You have burned your furniture, and it is still going out, and I crossed that yard on a rope I strung a month ago while you were laughing at my hole in the ground." She looked past him, at Cora, at the child who would not answer. "Cora, Nella needs to be warm within the hour, or she will not wake up. I have a warm room. It is a rope's length away. Come." Milo opened his mouth again, but it was Lavinia who ended it. Lavinia, who had not once set foot on the burned parcel, who had said, "She left you nothing but rocks," twice to Minta's face. Lavinia looked at her sister Cora, and at the small, still shape of her niece on the cold floor, and she stood up with Perrin in her arms. "We're going," Lavinia said. Not to Minta, to Milo. "Get out of the way of the door." 11 people went down into the vault that night, and the vault, built to keep grain, was asked to keep them all alive. The crossing back was a chain, each of them roped to the next. Minta at the front, reading the line by feel. The children carried. The frostbitten hired man half dragged. They lost no one in the white, though Perrin cried out once when he went to his knees and thought the rope had gone, and Minta felt that cry go through her worse than the cold. Then the hatch and the ladder and the impossible warmth of the little room rising up to meet them, and 11 people crowded into a space built for far fewer, and for one moment there was only the enormous relief of being out of the wind. The relief lasted less than an hour. 11 bodies in that small room threw off heat, and the stove threw off more, and the temperature climbed past 60 toward the comfortable air, and with the heat came moisture, breath, and wet clothing and melting snow. And the moisture found the cold stone of the walls and began to run down it in beads. The air grew thick and close, and then, without warning, the stove coughed. A roll of gray smoke pushed out around its door and hung in the room instead of climbing the pipe, and the flame behind the glass that had been standing bright and tall sank down and guttered and turned a sullen orange. Minta knew what it was before she knew how she knew. The fire was starving. The low intake duct, the mouth that fed the stove cold air from outside, had stopped feeding it. Somewhere above, the flung snow had drifted over the intake and packed it shut, and now the fire was pulling the air out of the room to breathe, the same air the 11 of them needed, and the smoke that should have gone up the pipe was coming into the room instead because the draft that carried it up had died with the air that fed it. The signs came fast, and they came through people, not through numbers. Tabitha's eldest began to whimper and hold his head. The hired man, already weak, put his back to the wall and slid down it. Cora pressed her hand to her temple, and Breka, on the bench, who had been fighting to stay awake for an hour, let his eyes fall closed and his gray head tipped, and Minta saw it and her whole body went cold in a way the room was not. She could not open the main hatch. That was the trap of it. The obvious thing, throw the door open and let air in, was the thing that would kill them. Open the hatch into that wind, and the storm would come down the stair in an avalanche of snow and cold, and worse, the rush of it would reverse the whole delicate balance of the room and drive every bit of the stove smoke back into their faces at once. She had learned that in December, with the downdraft, in a small way. Now she knew it in a way that mattered. The intake was buried. So the intake was what she had to clear, and to reach it she had to go where no grown person was meant to go, into the narrow service crawl her mother had left along the outside of the wall, barely wide enough for her shoulders, running the length of the room to where the intake duct came in from the world above. "Milo," she said, and she was already pulling the second rope to her, already tying it off. "When I'm in the crawl, you feed this and you do not pull unless I pull first. Tabitha, the stove, cut it down to almost nothing. We don't feed a fire that can't breathe. Nobody opens the hatch. Nobody. Say it." "Nobody opens the hatch," Tabitha said. Minta took the short shovel and went into the crawl on her belly, into a dark so tight the stone pressed her shoulders on both sides, and she pulled herself along it by her elbows toward the far end, where the cold came thin and wrong through the plugged duct. She reached the intake and found it packed solid. Snow, driven in and compressed by the wind until it was near as hard as ice, filling the whole throat of the duct from the outside. She got the shovel's edge to it in the cramped dark, and she chopped and dug and clawed, and it came away in packed chunks that she had to push back past her own body because there was nowhere else for them to go. Her arm went out through the duct at last into open air, and the drift she had been undermining collapsed inward around her arm and shoulder, pinning her, wedging her fast in the narrow stone, with the wind screaming an inch from her exposed hand. Behind her, back in the room, she could not see it, but she heard it. Milo's voice rising, ragged with fear, demanding that Tabitha open the hatch, that the children were dying, that the girl was stuck, and they would all suffocate in the dark waiting on her. And she heard Breka's voice, faint, dragged up out of him by will alone, stopping him. "Open it," Breka rasped, "and you kill them faster. The chimney reverses. You give them all the smoke at once. She knows the room. Wait for her." And then, weaker, "Tabitha, wait for her." And Tabitha, who had never once believed the vault would hold, who had told Minta to her face that the water would win in the end. Tabitha put her body between Milo and the hatch, and held. In the crawl, Minta worked her pinned arm free an inch at a time, and cleared the last of the packed snow with her bare fingers, and then the duct opened. She felt it before she understood it, a rush of cold, clean air pouring past her, sucked in through the freed intake, pulled down toward the starving fire. Back in the room, the flame heard it. The sullen orange sharpened to yellow, then to white, and stood up tall and hungry, and the roll of smoke that had hung in the air gathered itself and climbed the pipe the way it was built to, and the thick dead air of the room began all at once to move. The room breathed again, and it breathed because Minta understood it, not because the earth was kind and not because the walls were magic. Every soul in that room was alive because a girl her sisters called weak had crawled into a stone throat in the dark and given the fire back its breath. She backed out of the crawl shaking, and Tabitha pulled her the last of the way, and Minta lay on the floor of her mother's vault and got her own breath back while the fire roared clean above her. There was no time to rest. Nella was worse. The child had stopped shivering, and Cora, half mad with it, had her right up against the hot iron of the stove, and Minta made herself say the hard thing over the mother's protest. Not the stove. Cora, listen to me. Not the stove. It's too fast. It'll do more harm. Wet clothes off. All of them. She stripped the child-soaked layers herself when Cora's hands shook too badly, and wrapped her in dry wool, pulling from the stack of blankets. And it was there, reaching for them, that Cora saw. The blankets Aura had laid away were not all grown folks' size. Half of them were small, child size. Wrapped in oilcloth years ago by a woman planning for exactly this, for children she would never meet trapped in exactly this. Cora made a sound that was not quite a word. They warmed Nella the slow, safe way, in dry wool, with warm broth spooned between her lips, with the shared heat of Cora's own body inside the blankets, away from the killing shock of the stove. And after a time that felt like a year, the child's shivering came back, which Minta had to explain was the good thing, the body remembering how to fight. And then a fretful cry, and then Nella opened her eyes and asked for her mother in a small, cross voice, and Cora broke and wept over her, and Lavinia turned her face to the wall. Even then, Milo could not stop being Milo. He had watched the fire nearly die, and he had drawn the wrong lesson from it, and now he began feeding wood into the stove, chunk after chunk, trying to drive the room hot to make it 70, to make it summer because he was frightened, and heat felt like safety. Minta reached past him and took 2 of the pieces back out with the tongs. "There are 50 cords behind that wall," Milo said, staring at her. 50 cords, and you're rationing sticks." "There are 50 cords behind that wall," Minta agreed. "And 11 people in this room who need air more than they need 75 degrees. A bigger fire eats more air and throws more damp and berries that intake faster. You don't fight cold with a bonfire in a small room. You hold it steady and you keep it breathing." She set the stove back to its low, even burn, and no one, not even Milo, moved to change it, and in that silence, her authority over the room became a settled thing. The storm did not blow itself out in a night. It stayed 3 days. 3 days of that same standing wind, and in all 3 days the danger never fully left, because the flung snow kept trying to bury the vents faster than they could be kept clear. Minta set a watch. Every 2 hours, day and dark, someone climbed to check the intake and the exhaust and knocked the drift back before it could pack. She melted snow in the kettle Cora had once brought her in secret, and it gave them water. She issued food by weight, the way her mother's inventory taught her, so much per person per day, and not a spoon more, so that 11 people ate steadily and no one went short. And through all 3 days, the little room held its temperature between 56 and 62 degrees, and the cold room against the north wall never once dropped to freezing, and the vegetables kept, and the salt meat stayed dry, and the fire burned, all told across the whole of the emergency, less than a single cord of the 52. Above them, in those same 3 days, the ranch house that had held 1,200 cattle's worth of a family's fortune stood dark and open to the weather, its rooms full of drifted snow, uninhabitable. And out on the range, in the white, the cattle that were the whole of Milo's borrowed future stood and starved and froze, in numbers that would end the open range in that country forever. On the second night, unable to sleep in the crowded warmth, Lavinia went looking for something to do with her hands and found her mother's ledger where Minta kept it, and she read it by stove light. She read the columns of small figures, the wood bought idle season, the flour bought cheap, 5 years of quiet choices. And she came to the last written page, the inventory of everything the vault held, and she saw that Aura had not divided it among her daughters at all. She had divided it by purpose. Minta watched her sister read it, and read it with her in memory, because Minta knew every line. For those trapped by the snow, for the children first, for neighbors with no wood of their own, for the spring planting held back whole, not to be sold while another roof is cold. Lavinia sat with the ledger open on her knees a long time in the warm room she had refused to enter, holding the truth of it. Their mother had not left the vault to the daughter she loved best. She had left it to the daughter most likely to do what the ledger said, to keep it and open it and never sell it while another roof was cold. She had left it to the one who would obey. Lavinia did not say she was sorry. She was not ready, and Minta did not ask her to be. But she closed the ledger gently, the way you close a thing you have decided to believe, and she looked across the warm, crowded room at her youngest sister, and for the first time in her life she looked at Minta as though she were counting something and coming out surprised at the total. On the third night the wind began, at last, to fall. It did not stop. It eased, the standing pressure of it letting go by degrees until the moan through the earth softened and the flung snow slackened and the world above began, slowly, to be a place again. Inside the vault, they felt it, the loosening of the thing that had held them, and someone laughed for the first time in 3 days, and the children slept without whimpering, and Breka's breathing, propped upright on the bench, came a little easier. Minta let herself sit down against the warm stone and close her eyes, and in that quiet, in the new near silence where the wind had been, she heard a new sound, small, steady, wrong. Drip, drip, drip. She opened her eyes and turned toward the north wall, and there, where the mineral line ran level across the stone, the line Tabitha had put her hand on and called the mark of water, the line she had warned about from the very first day. A dark, wet gleam was spreading down the cold stone. The sudden change in the air, warm room, and easing storm meeting the deep frozen ground had started a thaw where no thaw should be, above a drain still locked solid with ice. The blizzard was ending. The water was beginning. The drip on the north wall was the storm's last trick, and Minta answered it before she slept. She opened the sump cover, chipped the ice back from the inner mouth of the drain, and set a length of the leftover stovepipe as a channel to carry the seep down and away from the food. By dawn, the wall had stopped weeping. When the 11 of them climbed out into the third morning, they came up into a country they did not recognize. Fences gone under drifts, corrals erased, the sheds flattened or buried, the ranch house standing dark and full of blown snow, and in the sheltered coulees, the cattle lay in heaps where they had crowded together and frozen, more of them than a person could count. That was the whole of the morning the story allowed itself. There was too much to do, because now the county wanted to see. Tabitha was the first to make them look, and she did it in the way that mattered most, by walking Eber Pike through the vault herself and telling him the plain truth with nothing shaved off it. She had been inside for the whole of the 3 days. She had watched the fire nearly die and watched it come back. She was the one skeptic no one could accuse of loving the place. Temperature never broke 62 and never fell below 56, Tabitha told him, standing in the winter room with her hand, out of old habit, on the mineral line. Cold room stayed above freezing the whole time. The potatoes came through sound. The meat's dry. No wall shifted, no beam dropped. She paused because she was an honest woman. The air did fail once. The intake drifted shut, and the fire started drowning us. And if she hadn't crawled into that wall and cleared it, we'd have died in here polite and warm, just like you always said. But she did clear it. She knew what was wrong before the rest of us knew anything was wrong at all. Tabitha looked at Pike, 11 of us went down. 11 came up. And I still say watch that wall come the real thaw. Both things are true. Pike went through it again himself, slower this time, on his own 2 feet. He measured the winter room while the air outside still stood below 0. He counted the fire gaps she had cut between the wood stacks and found them where he had told her to put them. He compared, in his commissary man's head, the 1/8 of a cord she burned in a day against the ruin of the ranch house that had eaten its whole winter's wood in 8 days and killed no cold at all. And when he had measured everything a man could measure, he stood in the low room and gave Minta the thing she had not known she was still waiting for. I was right about what could kill you down here, Pike said. The bad air, the fire, the water that's still coming. Every one of those could have finished you, and one of them near did. He worked his jaw. But I was wrong about the thing that matters. I said a hole in the ground wasn't a house because whoever dug it wouldn't know how to keep it from killing them. I was wrong about you. You knew. You knew before I did, down in that crawl. He put out his hand, which was not a thing Aber Pike did lightly. That's not a grave with shelves. That's the best-run cold room I've stood in, and I've stood in army stores from here to Bismarck. I'll say so to any man who asks. He said so to every man who asked, which after that winter was every man in the county. The numbers went with him, and the numbers did the rest. The ranch house had almost no wood left, and had stood below freezing indoors for 3 days after its chimney failed. The vault had burned under a single cord through the whole emergency, kept a warm room in the high 50s and low 60s, kept a cold room unfrozen, kept the meat dry and the flour whole, and had sheltered 11 souls. More than 50 cords still waited in the dark. People who had laughed at Minta's burrow in November came out over the drifts in February to stand in it and go quiet, and Minta opened it. She had them harness a sled, and she began to carry firewood out to the families snowed in around them, the Hales' place first, then the homesteads along the river bottom that had no wood left and no way to town. She did not sell a stick. She wrote each load in her mother's ledger, in her mother's columns, the cords, and the family, and the date, and beside the amount she wrote no price, only the word "it given." Pike put his commissary years to use inspecting the meat barrels before they were opened, tapping the salt beef, judging what was sound. Tabitha took charge of the flour and the beans and the bread. Cora, who had crossed the yard on a rope with her dying child, took the wool and the boot liners and the mittens and matched them to the families who needed them, and no one who saw her doing it called her Milo's wife anymore. They called her Cora. Lavinia came to the vault at last. She came with money. She meant to repay Minta out of her share of the ranch income, to make the firewood a debt and settle it clean, because a debt was a thing Lavinia understood and a gift was not. Minta refused it. You'll not pay me while there's a cold roof between here and Miles City, Minta said. Mother wrote it down, not to be sold while another roof is cold. You read it yourself. And Lavinia, who had said she left you nothing but rocks, put her money away and picked up an armload of wood and carried it to the sled without another word. And that was the first apology she ever made, though she never once said she was sorry. Milo made the opposite reckoning. He came to the vault while Minta was loading the sled and stood watching the wood go out, and Minta could see him counting it, not in cords, but in dollars. In the emergency price, it would fetch from every desperate rancher in the county who would pay anything for fuel in that winter. You're giving away a fortune, Milo said. There are men in town right now who'd pay $10 a cord, 20. You could clear the ranch's debt off that wood alone and have money left, and you're handing it out on a sled and writing, given next to it like a fool. He stepped closer. Sell it. Sell half. You keep enough to see yourself through, and you turn the rest into money while money can still save this family. or so help me, I'll find a judge who'll... Read the ledger, Milo. Minta did not stop loading. The last page. She wrote it before either of us knew it would matter. Not to be sold while another roof is cold. It isn't mine to sell. It was never mine to sell. It's a debt she left, and the debt is owed to whoever's freezing, and I mean to pay it. She straightened and looked at him. You want to take me to a judge over firewood I'm giving to widows in the worst winter this country's ever seen. Go on, find your judge, and then stand up in front of him and explain it. Milo turned to Cora for backing, the way he always had, and found none. He turned to Lavinia, and Lavinia had wood in her arms. He had counted on the sisters the way he counted on everything, as an asset, and the asset was gone. He left without another threat, but a threat that goes quiet is not a threat that goes away, and Minta knew it. The families kept coming, not for wood now, but for the how of it. That was the change that mattered more than the wood. Men who had a stone foundation, a bank to dig into, an old cellar half fallen, began coming to ask Minta how it was done, and she would not simply tell them, because she had learned in the crawl what a thing half understood could do to a person. She showed them. She lit a candle and held it low by the intake and high by the vent, and made them watch it lean two ways, the way her mother had once made her watch it in a summer dairy cellar, the way Brecca had made her watch it before he would let her light a fire. And she gave them one rule to carry home before any other, the rule she had paid for in split knuckles and a night pinned in the dark. Drainage before walls, Minta told them. Air before fire. Storage before comfort. You get those three in that order, or you don't start. The county began, that spring, to dig. But the ground had one more argument to make first, and it was the argument Tabitha had made from the very first day, standing at the mineral line with her hand on the stone. The thaw did not come gently. It came in a warm wind out of the southwest in the third week of March, and behind the wind came rain, and the two of them together went at the great winter snowpack all at once. The oxbow rose. Minta watched the gray water climb the cottonwood trunks along the bend a foot in a day, then two. And the danger was exactly the one Brecca had warned her of at the very start, and the one Tabitha had never let her forget. The ground under the melting snow was still frozen hard, 3 feet down and more, so the meltwater could not sink into it. It ran across the top instead, sheeting down the slope toward the burned foundation, toward the very drain she had cut, and where the drain's outlet met the frozen bank, the water met ice, and the outlet closed, and the water she had spent November teaching to run away had nowhere to go but up. It rose in the sump. She saw it standing there in the pit where it should have been draining, gray and still and climbing, and she understood that this was a wholly different fight than the blizzard had been. In January, the enemy had been cold, and heat was the answer, and the room breathing had been the answer. Now the cold meant nothing. The stove meant nothing. Now the enemy was the water and the weight of the saturated earth pressing on her walls, and if she lost this fight, nobody would freeze. The firewood would soak and rot. The flour would spoil. The whole of her mother's 5 years would turn to mud, and no one would even have the mercy of a clean disaster to blame it on. And Brecca could not come. His lungs had not recovered from the winter. He lay in a bed in Tabitha's cabin, propped upright to breathe, and when Minta went to him, he could barely get the words out, and the words he got out were not comfort. They were instruction. "Do not open the frozen outlet first," he said, resting between phrases. "You open it, the water behind it comes through all at once, and the rush takes the bank out. You take the pressure off first. Give the water somewhere else to go before you touch the ice." He gripped her wrist. "You know this. You cut the drain. You do not need me to hold the shovel. You need me to tell you that you already know. So, You already know. Go." She went, and she did it alone, and she did it in the order he had taught her without him there to check the order. She did not touch the frozen outlet. First, she cut a new channel, a raw, fast, ugly thing across the surface of the ground, parallel to the buried drain, running from the flooding uphill corner straight down to the low bank, to give the sheeting meltwater a path that did not go through her walls at all. She took the pressure off. Only when the water on the slope had a new road to run did she go to the sump and begin, carefully, to open the ice at the outlet, so that the standing water in the pit drew down slow instead of all at once. She moved the flour and the beans and the blankets up onto the high shelving above the old mineral line, above where any water had ever reached. She drove temporary timber shores against the damp north wall to hold it against the push of the sodden ground behind it. She set heavy stones at the mouth of the new channel where the rushing water tried to eat the bank, so the outlet could not erode itself into a collapse. And she organized the neighbors who came to help the way a foreman organizes a crew, telling them where they could dig and where they could not, keeping every man out from under the saturated overhang that could come down on a person without a sound. Milo came, on the second day, because word had gone around that the vault was flooding, and he came to watch it fail. He stood on the high ground with his hands in his pockets and waited for the north wall to fall in and prove, at last, that his dead mother-in-law had been a fool and her youngest daughter a bigger one. Minta put a shovel in his hands. "Your seed grain is down there," she said. "The last of it. The grain you've got to plant this spring or lose the ranch entire, eh? It's on my high shelf right now because I moved it up out of the wet myself this morning. You want it saved, you dig. That channel there. Follow the stakes. Don't dig past them." And Milo Drennan, who had offered her $20 for her whole inheritance and buried her drain with manure in the dark, looked at the stakes and looked at the water and took up the shovel and dug, because his own survival was down in the dark she had built, and she was the only one who knew how to save it. The channel held. The pressure came off the walls. The sump drew down. By the fourth day, the meltwater was running clean down Minta's raw new channel and out the low bank, and the north wall, shored and drained, had not moved, and the flour was dry on the high shelf and the seed grain with it. She had not only saved the vault, she had saved the spring planting for half the valley, because the seed reserve that got them all through to the next harvest had ridden out the flood on her shelves. The thing her mother built for one family in a blizzard had become, in a spring flood, the thing that kept a whole community's next year alive. And it had done it with Minta running it alone, which was the lesson the flood was really teaching, though she was too tired to hear it yet. She did not need Brekka's hands anymore. She had his knowledge in her own. Brekka knew it before she did. That was the beginning of the last part of them. Through that spring and summer, as his strength came back a little, and then, some weeks, less than a little, he stopped teaching her and began, without quite saying so, to consult her. He would sit on a stool at the vault mouth, out of the sun, and watch her work. And instead of telling her what to do, he would ask her what she meant to do, and then ask why. And then, more and more, he would nod and say nothing, because the answer was right and he had nothing to add to it. "If you built it again new," he asked her once, "what would you change?" And she told him, and it was a list, and every item on it was something the winter and the flood had taught her. Bigger heads on the vents, standing higher, so the drift could not bury them as fast. A channel cut along the inside foot of the cold wall to catch the condensation before it ran into the food. A second way out, a real one, so that 11 people were never again depending on one ladder and one hatch. A rod a person could work from inside to punch a buried vent clear without going up into the storm at all. And instructions written down, plain, so that the knowledge did not live only in one head, the way it had lived only in auras, and die with that head. That last one was where they finally clashed, and it was a real clash because it was two whole lives disagreeing. You write it down, Brecca said, and there was an old country hardness in it she had not heard from him before. And you give it to every fool with a shovel and a Sunday afternoon. And most of them will read half of it and skip the drainage because it is the hard part, and dig a hole and light a stove in it and die. Your mother knew this. That is why she taught it to nobody. That is why she made me swear. Knowledge like this you do not hand out. You hand it to the one person who has earned it, one person, the way she handed it to you. And if I died in that crawl, Minta said, it dies with me, the way it nearly died with her. She kept it so close it took a fever confession and 6 missing feet on a survey for me to find it at all. If Nella's older, if she's the one caught out in the next storm, does she get to freeze because her grandmother thought knowledge was a thing you hoard? She was not shouting. She never shouted. But she had gone very still, which was worse. You're right that half of them will skip the drainage, so I don't write it once and hand it over. I teach it, and I make them show me the candling in 2 ways before they light a fire. And I write the drainage first and biggest, and in words a frightened man can follow. You keep a thing too safe, Barent, and it's the same as losing it. I learned that this winter from you. Brecca looked at her a long time. His breath rasped in the quiet. Your mother, he said at last, would have argued the other side and known you were right. And that was as close as he came to yielding, and it was enough. And it was the last thing they ever fought about. They built the first new one together that autumn. To what? A small family cellar for a homesteader on the far ridge, 8 feet by 12, the first shelter of the new design built entirely to Minta's plan. Brika could no longer lift a stone. He sat and he watched, and when the roof beam went up, he asked her to strike it with the wooden mallet, the way he had struck the beams that first day in the dark. She struck it. She listened to the sound come back. What do you hear? Brecca asked. Weight carried evenly, Minta said. Brecca closed his eyes and smiled, the first full smile she had ever seen on him. Then you no longer need my ears, he said. He died the following spring in the bed in Tabitha's cabin, on a morning when the last of the snow was melting off the eaves and dripping steady outside the window. He went quietly in his sleep. Near the end of the season, he had helped her survive. Minta was sent for and came, and there was nothing dramatic in the room to meet her, and that was right for him. His stone hammer lay on the floor beneath the chair where he had set it down. One of his boots by the door was dark where the melting snow had wet it through the sole. Tabitha's children stood in the doorway not knowing what to do with their faces. Minta picked up the stone hammer. She had watched those hands hold it in the dark under thousands of pounds of earth and make her feel safe. She kept it. But his measuring rule, the folding wooden rule he had used to lay out every chamber and every drain and every vent, she did not keep. She gave it to Tabitha's eldest boy, who had watched her build the ridge cellar with his whole heart in his eyes, and she folded the boy's fingers around it the way Brecca had once folded hers around a wedge. The old man had carried a whole life of knowledge across an ocean and down a river and into the ground, and he had spent the last of it not on a monument, but on a girl the county had called weak, and now the girl was the one they came to, and the knowledge would not die when she did, because she had already begun to give it away. That was the answer to the fight they had had. He had been right that a secret dies with its keeper. She had been right that the only cure was to stop keeping it a secret. In the end, they had both been trying to save the same thing. If this story is reaching something in you, share it with someone who calls preparation selfish. What Burnt gave Minta wasn't a bunker. It was the reason to open one. and she opened hers every single time another roof went cold. She did not stop to grieve in the way that halts a life. She grieved the way he would have, with her hands. The autumn after his death, she and the men she was teaching built 2 more cellars along the river bottom and a larger shared shelter with the second exit she had wanted, and the tall vent heads, and the interior condensation channel. All the improvements from the list built now into stone the way she had once only sketched them in her mother's notebook. Pike's store began stocking the vent pipe and the hinges and the lime together and calling it, without irony now, a cellar set. Word of the design went up and down the rail line with the freight, and Minta Vale's name went with it, no longer as the mad girl in the grave, but as the woman you sent for before you closed a winter building or lit a stove underground. Which was exactly the trouble, because the word traveled faster than the teaching could, and not everyone who heard, "Dig a cellar with a stove and you'll live," stayed to hear the rest of it. On a hard, cold morning near the end of that following winter, a boy rode into the yard on a lathered horse from a homestead the far side of Miles City, a family Minta had never met, who had built themselves an underground room off nothing but the story of hers, and the boy could barely get the words out for the cold and the fear. His little sister had been found that morning on the floor of it, beside the stove, and she would not wake. Minta had her mare saddled before the boy finished speaking. She knew what a child found on a cellar floor beside a stove meant, and she knew the worst mistake the family would make in their terror was the one they were about to make. Carry the girl back down, build the fire up bigger, try to warm the life back into her in the same air that had taken it. She rode the frozen miles at a pace that would have shamed a younger woman, and she came into the strange yard shouting before she was off the horse, "Don't light it. Whatever you do, don't light that stove again. Bring her up. Bring her into the open air, now." They had the little girl up in the cold yard when Minta reached them, gray-faced and slack, and the father was already turning back toward the cellar mouth with an armload of wood, meaning to make it warm for the child's return, meaning well, about to kill her. Minta got between him and the hole. She had them lay the girl on a blanket in the clean, cold air, and she worked over her the way she had worked over Nella. And after a long and terrible minute, the child drew a rattling breath, and then another, and then began to cry, and the crying was the most beautiful sound in the county. Then Minta went down into their cellar to see what had nearly murdered a child, and she found every one of the mistakes she had spent 3 years warning against, all of them in one small room. There was no intake. None. They had built a stove into a hole with a chimney and no way for fresh air to reach the fire, so the fire had done the only thing a starved fire can do, pulled the air out of the room and given back smoke, slow and patient, all night, until it found the smallest sleeper first. The chimney was too short to draw properly, even if there had been air to draw. The firewood was stacked against the hot stove wall, one spark from a disaster on top of the disaster. The roof's drain emptied straight down beside the entrance, where the spring melt would pour in at the door, and there was one way out, a single ladder, the way there had been one ladder the night Minta crawled into the wall to save 11 lives. "You built the shape of it," she told the shaking father, "and none of the reasons. A stove in a hole is not what I do. A stove in a hole is a grave with a fire in it. A man told me that once, and he was right." She closed the cellar that day. She would not let them use it, not for a night, until it was made right, and she stayed and made it right with them, cut the intake duct, raised the chimney, moved the wood behind a partition, turned the roof drain away from the door, and though the terrain gave no room for a second full exit, she cut a small emergency scuttle to the surface, wide enough for a child to be passed up through. And she rode home and did the thing she and Burnt had fought about, the thing she had promised him she would do right. She sat down at her mother's table and she wrote it out, one page, in a plain hand, in words a frightened person could follow in the dark. Drainage first, and how to test the fall of it, the intake and the vent, and the candle that must lean two ways before a fire was ever lit. The fire kept apart from the fuel kept apart from the food. A second way out, and at the top, underlined twice, the rule she led with always: do not dig the room until you have solved the water. If you cannot solve the water, do not dig the room. From that winter on, no one got a plan for Minta Vale without the page that went with it, and no one lit a fire underground where she taught without showing her the candle leaning first. The county learned. That was the thing that let her sleep. By the early years of the 90s, the valley was a different place under its own surface than it had been the November the wagon left her at the ruin. 17 households had earth-covered storage rooms built to the plan and the page, small ones mostly, 8 by 12 and 10 by 14, dug into hillsides where the land allowed a walk-in entry instead of a ladder. 4 families along the exposed river bottom had gone together and built larger storm shelters, each with the 2 exits Minta insisted on, each with the tall vent heads standing above where the drifts came, each with a rod a person could work from inside to punch a buried vent clear without ever going up into the wind. Eber Pike sold the makings of it over his counter as a matter of course now. He kept the vent pipe and the elbows, the hinges and the strap iron, the lime, the little thermometers, and the small stove fittings all together in one corner, and when a man came in talking about digging in before winter, Pike sold him the lot and called it a cellar set, and then he told the man, in the voice of someone who had learned it the hard way, to go and see the Vale woman before he dug a single spade of it. The old commissary sergeant who had told her to sell while Drennan was still offering had become her loudest recommendation, and he never once acted as though there were anything strange in that, because to Pike there was not. He had been wrong, he had said so, a man said so, and went on. The knowledge had spread to hands, too, not just to holes. Tabitha Hales ran a communal food inventory for the shelter families, keeping the stores rotated, and counted the way Ora Vale had once counted alone in the dark. And when a widow's cellar came up short, it was Tabitha who quietly made it right and wrote "given" in the column. Cora took charge of the wool and the winter clothing for the whole arrangement, the blankets and the boot liners and the mittens in every size from a grown man to a newborn, and no child in that valley went into a storm season unshot again while Cora Drennan drew breath. And Lavinia kept the master ledger, the great reserve ledger in Ora's own 5 categories, in Lavinia's disciplined hand, for those trapped by the snow, for the children first, for neighbors with no wood of their own, for the spring planting held back whole, not to be sold while another roof was cold. The eldest sister, who had said her mother trusted her because she got the deed, had come, in the end, to understand what her mother had actually trusted, and to keep it. Minta had not planned an institution. She had only kept refusing to let anyone freeze. But that is how the thing had grown, refusal by refusal, until the burned parcel her sisters had laughed at was the center of how an entire valley kept itself alive through the winters, and the word cut into the old iron key had turned out to mean exactly what her mother meant it to mean. Milo Drennan came back in the middle of a storm, which was the only way his return could have meant anything. The years had not been kind to him, and none of the unkindness had been undeserved. The hard winter had killed the cattle that were the whole of his borrowed future, and the loans he had taken against them came due against nothing, and he spent the years after scrambling from one failing scheme to the next. He had tried once to sell his half of the ranch out from under Cora to settle a debt, and Cora, who had once begged him never to learn she'd brought her sister a kettle, had stood up in front of the man's own creditor and invoked her own name on the deed, and refused, because her mother had married into a family where the women kept their own books, and Cora had finally remembered it. Milo had gone east after that to look for work in a country that did not know him, and he had come back some seasons later, a smaller man than the one who had offered Minta $20 for everything she owned. He drove into the yard of the burned parcel on a bad night near the end of a February, snow coming down in earnest, and Minta braced herself for whatever last grasping thing he had come to try. But he did not get down with papers or threats or an offer. He got down and walked around to the back of his wagon and dropped the tailgate, and the wagon was loaded to the boards with cut stone. "You always wanted a second way out of the old vault," Milo said. He did not look at her while he said it. He looked at the stone. "For the crowd nights. You never had the hands to cut the outer stair. I've got hands. I've got nothing this winter but hands." He finally turned and met her eyes, and there was no scheme left in him, only a hard, flat honesty that cost him more than any of his old charm ever had. "I kept counting what the ranch could sell," Milo said. "Every cord, every barrel, I saw a price on it. Your mother counted what a winter could take. That's the whole of the difference between us, and it took me losing everything to see it, and I'm too old now to be proud about saying so out loud." Minta looked at the stone in his wagon a long moment. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to turn him away, and no one who knew the history would have blamed her. "The second exit's needed," she said at last. "The crowd nights are worse every year. More families come now than the old room was built for." She nodded toward the ruin. "You can cut it, but not for me, and not on your own say. Cora runs the labor on this place now, the building of it. You'll take your work from her, same as any man. If she says the stair's wrong, you cut it again." Something moved across Milo's face. The old pride, rising up out of habit at the thought of taking orders from his own wife, and then visibly lying back down. "All right," he said. "From Cora." He cut the outer stair that winter under Cora's eye, and it was good work, and when it was done, he did not ask for thanks or for the return of anything. He simply had a place, at last, in the thing he had spent years trying to tear down, a small place, and earned one, at the bottom of the authority he had once assumed was his by right. It was not forgiveness, exactly. Minta never used the word. But the stair he cut carried people up out of the crowd nights for the next 30 winters, and every one of them climbed it, and that was a better thing than forgiveness. It was use. Alden Bixby she met over an argument, which was the only way she could ever have come to trust a man. He was a bridge carpenter for the Northern Pacific, 9 and 20, come out to rebuild the culvert housings the hard winter, and the floods behind it had torn out along the line. He heard about the Vale Woman's shelters, the way everyone heard, and being a man who built things to stand against water and weather for a living, he rode out to see the larger river bottom shelter with a professional's skepticism and a professional's eye. Minta was there when he came, and she watched him walk it, and she saw him find the thing he thought was the flaw. "Your roof spans are too light," Alden said. He said it plainly, not unkindly, the way one builder speaks to another he assumes is an amateur. "You've got the beams too far apart and too small for the load of the earth and the snow on top of it. Heavier timber, closer set, that's what keeps a roof up under a Montana winter. I'd not trust my weight to this." "The roof's not what fails," Minta said. "The roof is always what fails." "Not here." She did not raise her voice. She never had. "I've built and watched a dozen of these through the worst winters this country's given, and not one roof has come down. You know what comes down? The wall the water got behind. Every time. A man builds his roof twice as heavy as it needs to be, and skips the drain because the drain is the hard, dull, underground part nobody sees, and then the spring melt soaks the ground behind his beautiful heavy wall, and the whole thing lets go, and he dies under the strongest roof in the county. She held his eye. Your beams are fine. Come back in the thaw and I'll show you what a wall does when the water's handled, and what it does when it isn't. Then tell me which one to spend the timber on. Alden Bixby was a proud man and a good one, and the two do not always go together, but in him they did. He did not argue. He came back in the thaw. He watched Minta's shore-drained wall stand dry against the meltwater, while an old, undrained bank on a neighboring claim slumped and sagged exactly as she had said it would. And then Alden Bixby did the thing that made Minta trust him. The one thing. He did not tell her privately that she'd been right. He told the other men. He stood in front of a crew of railroad carpenters who respected him and said that the Veil woman had taught him more about keeping a structure up than his years on the bridges had, and that any man who built a winter room without solving his water first was a fool, and that he'd said as much to her face and been wrong. He credited her in public. Burnt had once folded her fingers around a wedge. Alden folded his pride into a sentence and handed it to her in front of witnesses, and that was its own kind of gift, and Minta knew the size of it. They courted the way they had met over work. There were joint inspection trips up and down the line, the two of them riding out to look at some family's half-dug room and disagreeing the whole way there and the whole way back and being right, between them, more often than either was alone. There were arguments over roof spans that never fully resolved and never needed to. There was a hard winter when the railroad's culvert housings froze and split, and the two of them spent 6 weeks repairing them side by side in the cold. And somewhere in those 6 weeks, the arguing had turned into something neither of them named for a while, because naming it would have interrupted the work. And there was the thing Minta noticed and never mentioned and never forgot, that when Alden drew up a plan for a shelter now, he wrote her name on the drawing beside his own. Every drawing, without discussion, as though it had never occurred to him to do otherwise. They married several years after the winter that made her, in a quiet way, in the spring, and they built no grand house to mark it. They lived on the 6 acres above the chambers, in a plain, snug home Alden raised with his own hands and Minta's drains, and in time they had a daughter. They did not name her Minta. Minta would not have it. They named her Ora Tabitha Bixby, for the mother who had counted what a winter could take, and for the neighbor who had held the hatch shut and waited when a frightened man begged her to open it. The child grew up playing on the burned stones her aunt had once called worthless, and learning, before she could well read, how to tell by a candle's lean whether a room was breathing. Minta never became what her sisters had been left. She never became a cattle baron or a rich woman or the mistress of the big house. The big house was rebuilt eventually by Lavinia's people, a fine thing on the old ranch ground. And Minta was invited to live in it, and declined, and stayed on her 6 acres above the chambers until she was an old woman. She changed the vault as the years changed what it was for. One fuel gallery she kept as it had always been, a standing reserve of wood against the winter that would surely come again someday, because a woman who had lived through the hard winter did not believe in mild ones. The second gallery, emptied by all the giving, she made into a workshop and a teaching room, and it was there she showed 2 generations of that valley how a room breathes and why the drainage comes first. The dry room held the community's emergency stores under Lavinia's ledger. The winter room stood always ready for the crowd nights. The center hatch, the vertical drop she had dug down to with a shovel that first freezing afternoon, she finally replaced with the sloped outer stair Milo cut. 2 good doors at the top of it, so that no one else ever had to go down a ladder into the dark the way she had. But the burned foundation above it all, she never rebuilt into anything grand. She left the ruin a ruin. She left it looking, to any stranger passing on the road, exactly as worthless as it had looked the day Lavinia said so. Because the ruin was the whole point, and Minta understood that better than anyone alive. What kept you was not the part of a place that looked like wealth. It was the part underneath that no one thought to want. She taught cellar safety into her 60s, and her later years were measured not in money but in the columns of her mother's ledger, carried forward in her own hand and then her daughter's. The cords issued, the seed preserved, the families sheltered through this storm and that one, the repairs a room had needed, the mistakes noted down so no one need make them twice. And there was one thing the valley told about her in her last years that was true. Her eyes failed her toward the end, the way eyes do. But blind or near it, she could still be led into a room, any room, and stand a moment and tell you whether it was breathing. She would call for a candle, and someone would light it and hold it low for her, and she would put her weathered hand near the small flame and feel which way it leaned, and she would tell them, without ever seeing it, whether the air was moving as it should, and she was never once wrong. They learned it from her by the hundreds. In the end, the 17 households and the 4 shelters that first decade, and then their neighbors and their neighbors' neighbors, until earth-covered rooms with proper drains and two-way air ran up and down that stretch of the Yellowstone. In numbers no one had counted, every one of them carrying somewhere in the family that built it, a plain page in a plain hand that began with the water and ended with a candle. The original 52 cords were given away and burned and shared and replaced so many times over the decades that not a stick of the first wood remained. What remained was the practice of keeping the reserve full, which was the only part her mother had ever truly meant to leave. Minta Bell Vale, who became Minta Bixby, lived out her life on the 6 acres above the chambers, and never in the house on the hill she was offered. She died an old woman in the spring, with the snow melting off the eaves, the way her teacher had, and her daughter Ora held her hand at the end, and the last thing she asked for was not a doctor or prayer, but a candle held low, so she could feel one more time the air of the room she was in moving the way it should. It is worth going back, at the last, to a blue winter dusk over the oxbow, and the wind shaving loose snow off the top of a ruined stone wall, the way it did the January the country came for them all, and the cold fell past 40 below and stayed there. A stranger passing that ruin in such a dusk would see exactly what Lavinia Vale saw the day the will was read, and would say what Lavinia said. She left you nothing but rocks. But go closer in that killing cold, and you would see the truth the stranger missed. Smoke rising steady and clean from a chimney set among the ruined stones, because stone carried the roof, and stone kept the meltwater off the flour, and stone turned the wind from the chimney's mouth, and stone made the steps that 11 pairs of boots once climbed up out of the dark alive. Inside, children hang their wet mittens by a small iron stove, while the storm spends itself harmlessly overhead, and the seed for the spring stands dry beyond a stone partition, and a wall of chalk figures runs on into the dark where a woman once wrote her first quiet count, and on a nail beside the sloped stair hangs a smoke-stained iron key, its one scratched word still plain after all the years. Center. What Ora Vale left her youngest daughter was not the part of the ranch everyone could see. It was the part that would still be standing when everything else had been taken,